Have you ever witnessed someone's arrogance backfire so fast it gave you physical whiplash? We've all seen examples of wild entitlement in public, but what happens when a smug flight crew decides to publicly humiliate a passenger based purely on his appearance, only to discover they just picked a fight with the man who practically signs their paychecks? This isn't just another annoying airport dispute over legroom. This is a masterclass in staying ice cold while letting toxic people dig their own professional graves. Stick around, because the level of instant, catastrophic karma in this true-to-life story is going to leave you absolutely speechless. Fluorescent lights buzzed relentlessly overhead in Terminal 4 of Phoenix Sky Harbor International Airport. It was a Tuesday morning, the kind of early hour where the air smells distinctly of stale coffee, expensive duty-free perfume, and collective exhaustion. Dylan Sterling stood quietly near Gate B-22, rubbing the bridge of his nose. He had just wrapped up a grueling 72-hour marathon of closed-door negotiations and legal briefings. He was running on barely 3 hours of sleep, a half-eaten protein bar, and sheer willpower. Dylan didn't look like a man who had just orchestrated a multi-million-dollar corporate buyout. At 38, he preferred comfort over performative wealth. Today, that meant a pair of tailored but unassuming charcoal joggers, pristine white sneakers, and a faded grey Yale University hoodie. His noise-cancelling headphones rested around his neck, and his dreadlocks were pulled back neatly into a tie. To anyone paying attention to his demeanour, he exuded a quiet, unshakable confidence. But to people who only looked at the surface, he was just a guy in sweatpants taking up space in the premium boarding lane. Behind the gate counter stood Brenda Collins. Brenda was a veteran gate agent for Atlantic Horizon Airlines, a woman whose tight, shellacked blonde bun seemed to reflect her rigid view of the world. She had been scanning boarding passes for 15 years and prided herself on her intuition regarding who belonged where. As the boarding announcement for Flight 408 to New York's JFK sounded, Brenda's eyes darted over the passengers lining up in Zone 1. Her gaze stopped abruptly on Dylan. Dylan was the third person in the first-class priority line. Directly behind him was Arthur Pendleton, a red-faced, barrel-chested businessman in a sharp navy Brioni suit, aggressively tapping a gold Rolex watch and sighing loudly enough for the entire terminal to hear. Zone 1, First Class and Diamond Medallion members, you may now board, Brenda announced into the PA system, her voice dripping with practiced, artificial sweetness. The first two passengers, a wealthy older couple, scanned their phones and walked down the jet bridge. Dylan stepped up, his phone screen brightly displaying his digital boarding pass. He held it out over the scanner. Before the machine could even register the QR code, Brenda's hand slapped down over the glass scanner, blocking it. "Excuse me, sir," Brenda said, her voice dropping the sugary tone and taking on a sharp, authoritative edge. "This line is for Zone 1, First Class and Diamond members only." Dylan blinked, mildly surprised but keeping his composure. "I know. That's why I'm in it." Brenda offered a thin, patronizing smile. She looked him up and down, her eyes lingering judgmentally on his hoodie. "I understand it can be confusing, but the main cabin and basic economy lines are Zones 3 and 4. They will board in about 20 minutes. I need you to step aside so our priority passengers can board." Behind Dylan, Arthur Pendleton scoffed loudly. "Unbelievable. People just don't know how to read signs anymore. Hey, pal, some of us have actual places to be. Move it along." Dylan didn't even turn around to acknowledge Arthur. Instead, he kept his eyes locked on Brenda. He slowly lifted his phone, turning the screen so she could read the large, bold letters perfectly. "Seat 1A, Dylan said, his voice smooth, low, and entirely devoid of the anger Brenda seemed to be anticipating. Zone 1, Boarding Group, Diamond. Brenda's eyes narrowed as she read the screen. A flicker of confusion crossed her face, immediately replaced by deep suspicion. She snatched the phone from Dylan's hand, a massive breach of protocol, and squinted at the digital ticket. "How did you get this?" she asked, her tone entirely accusatory. "I paid for it," Dylan replied, his patience beginning to fray at the edges, though his face remained a mask of polite indifference. "With money. I believe that's how airline tickets work." "There must be a glitch in the system," Brenda muttered loudly, making sure Arthur behind him could hear. "We've been having issues with third-party booking sites, issuing fraudulent upgrades. I'm going to have to verify this." "Verify whatever you need to," Dylan said, crossing his arms. "But I booked that directly through the Atlantic Horizon corporate portal." Brenda began violently typing on her keyboard, hitting the keys with unnecessary force. She stared at the monitor, waiting for the system to give her the ammunition she needed to kick him out of her line. But the screen didn't lie. The ticket was valid, fully paid, not a complimentary upgrade, not a buddy pass, a full-fare first-class ticket. Furthermore, his frequent flyer status glowed a bright, undeniable diamond. Her jaw tightened. She couldn't find a single discrepancy. Reluctantly, she shoved the phone back toward him. "Fine, but the scanner is acting up. Just go ahead." She didn't apologize. She didn't say, "Welcome aboard," or "Thank you for flying with us." She just dismissed him with a flick of her wrist. As Dylan walked past her and headed down the long, sloping jet bridge, he heard Brenda's voice suddenly pitch an octave higher, returning to that sweet, syrupy tone. "Mr. Pendleton, so wonderful to see you again. Welcome back. Right this way, sir." Dylan shook his head, a dark, knowing smile touching his lips. What Brenda Collins didn't know, what nobody on this flight crew knew, was that Dylan Sterling wasn't just a Diamond Medallion member. His private equity firm had officially signed the paperwork to acquire a 60% controlling stake in Atlantic Horizon Airlines precisely 14 hours ago. The ink on the merger documents was barely dry. Dylan was doing something the outgoing board of directors rarely did. He was flying his own commercial routes, unannounced, to see exactly how the frontline staff operated. So far, they were failing miserably. Stepping onto the Boeing 777, Dylan was greeted by the plush, dimly lit interior of the first-class cabin. Atlantic Horizon had recently retrofitted their flagship planes with private, pod-style seating, complete with sliding doors and premium leather. It was a beautiful product, one Dylan had personally reviewed in the acquisition files. Standing near the galley was Samantha Higgins, the lead flight attendant. Samantha was a 20-something influencer wannabe who treated her position in first class less like a hospitality job and more like a high-society networking event. She was currently adjusting her silk scarf in a mirrored bulkhead, looking entirely disinterested in the boarding process. Dylan found his seat, 1A, the prime bulkhead window seat on the port side. He hoisted his sleek leather duffel bag into the overhead bin, closed it quietly, and slid into the wide, comfortable seat. He let out a long breath, hoping to finally close his eyes and get some rest before touching down in New York. "Excuse me." A sharp voice pierced his quiet moment. Dylan opened his eyes. Samantha was standing over him. She wasn't offering him the customary pre-flight champagne or a warm towel. She was holding a passenger manifest tablet, and she looked annoyed. "Yes?" Dylan asked. "I think you've made a wrong turn," Samantha said, not bothering to hide the condescension in her voice. "This cabin is reserved for our premium guests. Economy is through the curtain and to the back." Dylan let out a heavy sigh. Twice in 10 minutes. It was almost comical if it wasn't so deeply insulting. I am in the correct seat, Dylan said. 1A. Samantha rolled her eyes. Sir, I have the manifest right here. I know who is supposed to be sitting in my cabin. I need you to gather your things and move to the back before you hold up the boarding process. Right at that moment, Arthur Pendleton strolled into the cabin. He saw Dylan sitting in 1A and stopped dead in his tracks. You've got to be kidding me, Arthur boomed, looking at Samantha. Sam, why is this guy in my row? Mr. Pendleton, Samantha beamed, instantly transforming from an ice queen into a fawning host. I am so sorry. I'm handling it right now. Let me just get him out of your way. She turned back to Dylan, the smile vanishing instantly. Sir. Boarding pass. Now. Dylan calmly pulled his phone out again and brought up the ticket. He held it up. Samantha leaned in, expecting to see a fake or an economy ticket. When she read the large 1A, she hesitated, her brow furrowing. She looked down at her tablet, swiping rapidly. There's a mistake, she declared stubbornly. The system must have double-booked. The system didn't double-book, Dylan corrected her gently. Mr. Pendleton is in 1B, the aisle seat. I am in 1A. There is no conflict. Arthur leaned over, his face flushing red with indignation. Listen here, pal. I fly this route every week. I always sit in row 1, and I don't sit next to people who look like they're headed to a gym in the Bronx. Sam, I need this handled. I need quiet to work on this flight. Samantha nodded vigorously, eager to please the loud, demanding businessman. Of course, Mr. Pendleton. I completely understand. She looked down at Dylan. Sir, we have an operational issue with this seat. It's broken. I'm going to have to relocate you. Dylan raised an eyebrow. He shifted his weight, reclining the seat backward, then bringing it forward. He tapped the touch-screen monitor. It lit up brightly. He adjusted the reading light. Everything worked flawlessly. Seems to be in perfect working order to me, Dylan stated, staring dead into Samantha's eyes. Samantha's face flushed with anger. Her authority was being challenged in front of a regular VIP. Sir, you do not tell me what is or isn't broken on my aircraft. Furthermore, we actually need this seat for a federal air marshal. It's a security protocol. I'm going to have to reassign you to seat 34E in the main cabin. The sheer audacity of the lie left Dylan speechless for a fraction of a second. She had gone from wrong cabin to double-booked to broken seat to federal air marshal in the span of 90 seconds. It was a masterclass in aggressive discrimination. She was desperately throwing every excuse at the wall just to get the black man in the hoodie out of first class. You're downgrading a full-fare, diamond status passenger from first class to a middle seat in the back of the plane because of a sudden, unverified security protocol, Dylan asked, his voice ringing with absolute clarity. Several other passengers who had boarded were now stopping in the aisle, watching the drama unfold. I am a lead flight attendant, and I am giving you a crew member instruction, Samantha snapped, her voice rising. Federal law requires you to comply with crew instructions. If you refuse, you are interfering with a flight crew, which is a federal offense. Now, grab your bag and move to the back, or I will have you removed from this aircraft. Dylan leaned back in his seat, lacing his fingers together over his stomach. He was no longer just annoyed. He was professionally furious. This wasn't just bad service. This was a massive liability. If they were doing this to him, they were doing it to hundreds of other paying customers. I'm not going anywhere, Dylan said quietly. If you want me out of this seat, you're going to have to give me a legitimate, legally binding reason in writing, signed by the complaint resolution official. Samantha gasped dramatically, acting as though Dylan had just threatened her life. Fine, she spat. You want to play it the hard way? You're done. You're not flying today." She spun on her heel and marched furiously toward the cockpit, the heavy door clicking open as she barged inside. Arthur Pendleton chuckled darkly, sliding into seat 1B across the aisle. "You really messed up now, kid. Captain Miller doesn't take any disrespect. You should have just taken the walk of shame to economy when you had the chance. Now you're going to get dragged off in handcuffs." Dylan just smiled, a cold, empty smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We'll see about that, Arthur." Less than 2 minutes later, the cockpit door swung open violently. Out stepped Captain Richard Miller. Miller was the textbook definition of an old-school, arrogant pilot who believed the airplane was his personal kingdom. He had silver hair, a crisp white uniform, adorned with 4 gold stripes on the epaulets, and a permanent scowl that suggested he found the very existence of passengers to be a personal inconvenience. He had been flying for 20 years and had a reputation for throwing his weight around to intimidate anyone who dared question his crew. Samantha trailed behind him, wearing a smug, triumphant smirk. She pointed a manicured finger directly at Dylan. "That's him, Captain. He's being belligerent, refusing to follow crew instructions, and making me feel unsafe." Captain Miller marched down the short aisle and stopped right next to Dylan's seat, towering over him to maximize the intimidation factor. "All right, buddy," Miller barked, his voice loud enough to echo into the business class cabin. "I don't know who you think you are, but on my airplane, what my crew says goes. You've been asked nicely to relocate. You refused. You're causing a disturbance. Gather your belongings and step off the aircraft." Dylan didn't flinch. He looked up at the pilot, his expression completely neutral. "Captain Miller, I assume?" Dylan read the name tag pinned to the man's chest. "Let me be very clear about what has happened here. I boarded this aircraft with a valid first-class ticket. Your flight attendant approached me, made 3 separate, contradictory excuses as to why I needed to vacate the seat, and then threatened me with federal charges when I asked for a valid reason." "I don't care about your excuses," Miller interrupted, jabbing a thick finger in Dylan's direction. "She said the seat is needed for operational reasons. That's the end of the discussion. You are now a disruptive passenger. You have 2 choices. You walk off this plane on your own 2 feet right now, or I call Port Authority police to drag you off. And if they drag you off, you're going on the no-fly list. Your choice." The tension in the cabin was palpable. Every passenger in first class was staring. Arthur Pendleton was grinning like he was watching a premium boxing match. "Rick, just get him out of here," Arthur chimed in, using the pilot's first name. "He's clearly unhinged. I don't feel safe flying with him sitting next to me." "Don't worry, Arthur," Captain Miller said to the businessman, giving him a reassuring nod. "He's leaving." Dylan pulled out his phone again. "Captain, I am formally requesting that the gate agent, the complaint resolution official, and a supervisor be brought onto this aircraft before I move an inch. You are in violation of the airline's contract of carriage, not to mention federal anti-discrimination laws." Miller laughed, a harsh, grating sound. "You think you can quote the rule book to me? I am the rule book on this metal tube. You don't get a supervisor. You get the cops." Miller reached up to his shoulder mic to radio the gate. "Gate, this is the captain. I need law enforcement at the aircraft. Gate B, 22. We have a hostile passenger refusing to deplane." "Copy that, Captain," a voice crackled back over the radio. "Port Authority is on their way." Samantha crossed her arms, looking down at Dylan with sheer delight. "You really should have just moved when I told you to. Now you're going to jail over a seat." Dylan looked at Samantha, then at Arthur, and finally at Captain Miller. They were entirely convinced of their own untouchable power. They thought they were dealing with a nobody, a guy in a hoodie they could bully into submission or throw into a police car to protect their fragile egos and prejudices. "Captain," Dillon said, his voice dropping to a low, dangerous register, "I am going to give you one final opportunity to walk back to your cockpit, close the door, and fly this plane to New York. If you insist on bringing law enforcement onto this aircraft, the consequences for your career and the careers of your crew will be absolute and irreversible." Miller scoffed, leaning in closer. "Are you threatening me, son?" "It's not a threat," Dillon said, unlocking his phone and dialing a number he knew by heart. "It's a guarantee." Dillon placed the phone to his ear. The line rang twice before it was picked up. "Marcus," Dillon said into the phone, speaking to his chief operating officer back in New York. "I'm on Flight 408 out of Phoenix. Yes, the flight I'm taking to HQ. We have a situation. I need you to conference in the VP of Flight Operations, the head of Human Resources, and the chief legal counsel immediately. Tell them to pull up the live feed and crew manifest for this flight." Captain Miller paused, a slight flicker of hesitation crossing his face. Arthur Pendleton frowned, his confident grin wavering just a fraction. "Who the hell are you calling?" Samantha demanded, her voice losing a bit of its bravado. Dillon lowered the phone from his ear and looked directly into Captain Miller's eyes. "I'm calling the people who are going to process your terminations," Dillon replied evenly. "My name is Dillon Sterling. I am the CEO of Sterling Management. As of 8 p.m. last night, my firm owns a 60% controlling stake in Atlantic Horizon Airlines, and you, Captain, are currently threatening to arrest your new boss." The color drained from Captain Miller's face so fast it was as if someone had pulled a plug. For a long, agonizing moment, the only sound in the first-class cabin of Flight 408 was the low, steady hum of the Boeing 777's auxiliary power unit. The silence was absolute, heavy, and suffocating. The air seemed to have been violently sucked out of the room. Captain Richard Miller stared at Dillon, his jaw slightly slack. The arrogant sneer that had plastered his face just seconds prior was frozen, morphing rapidly into a mask of pure, unadulterated shock. He blinked once, twice, his brain desperately struggling to process the impossible information it had just received. That's a bluff," Miller finally stammered, though his voice had lost all of its booming authority. It sounded thin, reedy, and laced with sudden panic. "You're lying. The buyout wasn't finalized. The board signed the final equity transfer at 8 p.m. Eastern Standard Time last night in a closed session meeting at the Waldorf Astoria," Dillon replied smoothly, his eyes never leaving the pilot's face. "The press release is scheduled to hit the wire at 9:30 a.m. That's in exactly 12 minutes. Across the aisle, Arthur Pendleton had abruptly stopped chuckling. The wealthy businessman was suddenly pale. His hands, which had been comfortably folded over his stomach, were now frantically fumbling in his suit jacket pocket. He yanked out his smartphone, his thumbs flying across the screen as he opened the Bloomberg Terminal app. Samantha Higgins, the flight attendant who had initiated this entire catastrophe, looked back and forth between Dillon and the captain, her wide eyes reflecting the sheer terror of someone who suddenly realized they had just jumped out of an airplane without a parachute. "Captain," she whispered, her voice trembling. "He's making this up, right? He's just a disruptive passenger. We need to get him off." Before Miller could formulate a response to his panicked flight attendant, heavy, rhythmic footsteps echoed down the jet bridge. 2 Port Authority police officers stepped into the cabin. They were heavily geared, their expressions stern and strictly professional. The lead officer, a tall, imposing man with the nameplate Reynolds pinned to his chest, rested his hand casually near his utility belt. He scanned the cabin, immediately taking in the tense standoff. "Captain," Officer Reynolds said, his deep voice slicing through the tension. "We got a call about a hostile passenger refusing to deplane. Who's causing the disturbance?" Samantha, driven by sheer, desperate denial, immediately pointed a shaking finger at Dylan. "Him! Officer, it's him! He's refusing to follow federal crew instructions and he's threatening us." Officer Reynolds turned his gaze to Dylan. He took a step forward, his posture authoritative. "Sir, I need you to stand up, grab your bag, and step off the aircraft right now. We can figure this out in the terminal, but you are not flying today." Dylan did not stand up. He did not reach for his bag. Instead, he tapped the screen of his phone, turning on the speakerphone, and set the device carefully on the wide armrest of his first-class seat. "Harrison," Dylan said, his voice calm and carrying perfectly in the dead silent cabin. "Are you on the line?" "I'm here, Dylan." A crisp, deeply authoritative voice echoed from the phone speaker. "I have Sarah Jenkins from HR and Thomas Waverley from Legal on the conference line as well. We are pulling up the flight manifest and crew roster for Flight 408 right now." Officer Reynolds paused, a look of profound confusion crossing his face. He looked at Captain Miller, who was now sweating profusely, a visible sheen of moisture forming on his forehead. "Excuse me," Officer Reynolds said, leaning closer to the phone. "Who am I listening to right now?" "Officer, my name is Harrison Cole," the voice on the phone replied instantly. "I am the Vice President of Flight Operations for Atlantic Horizon Airlines. You are currently standing on my aircraft. I need you to hold your position and take no action against the passenger in seat 1A. That is Dylan Sterling, the Chief Executive Officer of Sterling Management, and as of last night, the majority owner of this airline." The collective gasp from the surrounding passengers was audible. Several people in the rows behind them literally stood up to get a better look. Arthur Pendleton dropped his phone into his lap. The screen was glaringly bright, displaying a breaking news alert from the Wall Street Journal. "Sterling Management secures 60% stake in Atlantic Horizon. Dylan Sterling to assume role as chairman." "Oh my God," Arthur whispered, the blood completely draining from his face. He looked at Dylan, his eyes wide with a sudden, horrifying realization of his own complicity. You really are Dylan Sterling." Officer Reynolds stepped back, his hands instantly moving away from his belt. He looked at Dylan, then turned a searing, furious glare upon Captain Miller. "Captain," the officer said, his voice dropping an octave, practically vibrating with anger. "Did you just call armed law enforcement onto this aircraft to remove your own CEO because you didn't like the look of him?" Miller's mouth opened and closed like a fish suffocating on dry land. He looked at the phone, then at Dylan, and finally at the police officer. I was acting on information provided by my lad flight attendant," Miller deflected weakly, throwing Samantha under the bus without a second's hesitation. "She informed me he was uncooperative and in the wrong cabin." Samantha gasped, looking at the captain with an expression of pure, unfiltered betrayal. "What? You told me to handle him. You told me you didn't care about his ticket." "Samantha Higgins," a new voice spoke from the phone on the armrest. It was a woman's voice, sharp, clinical, and completely devoid of warmth. "This is Sarah Jenkins, Head of Human Resources. Please confirm you are the lead flight attendant on this flight." Samantha burst into tears. It wasn't a graceful cry. It was the ugly, hyperventilating sob of a woman watching her entire livelihood burn to the ground in real time. "Yes," she choked out. "But I thought his ticket was a glitch. The scanner." "Ms. Higgins," Dylan interrupted quietly, picking up his phone and holding it in his hand. He didn't yell. He didn't need to. His quiet authority was far more devastating than any shouting could ever be. You told me I was in the wrong cabin. Then you told me my seat was double booked. When I proved that was a lie, you claimed the seat was broken. And when I demonstrated the seat was perfectly functional, you lied again, claiming it was needed for a federal air marshal. You didn't do this because of a glitch. You did this because I am a black man in a hoodie, and you decided, based purely on your own prejudice, that I didn't belong in your presence. Samantha buried her face in her hands, her shoulders shaking violently. She had no defense. Every word he said was true, and every excuse she had made was systematically dismantled in front of the police, her captain, and a cabin full of witnesses. Dillon turned his attention back to the pilot. And you, Captain Miller. Rather than assessing the situation, verifying my documentation, or acting with a shred of the professionalism expected of your rank, you attempted to use the Port Authority Police as your personal bouncers to enforce a racist, classist eviction. You threatened me with the no-fly list. You threatened me with handcuffs. Miller swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. Mr. Sterling, sir. Dillon, please. This is a massive misunderstanding. If I had known who you were, if you had known who I was, you would have treated me with respect. Dillon finished the sentence for him, his voice like cracking ice. Which proves my point entirely, Richard. You only respect power. How do you treat the everyday paying customers who don't own the airline? How many people have you bullied, intimidated, and thrown off your flights just to stroke your own ego? None. Never, Miller protested, panic completely eroding his stoic pilot facade. I swear to you, sir, I have a flawless record. I've been flying for 20 years. Then you should have known better, Dillon said softly. He looked down at the phone. Harrison, are you hearing this? Loud and clear, Dillon, Harrison Cole replied grimly. What is the protocol for a flight crew explicitly violating the federal contract of carriage, engaging in blatant discriminatory harassment, and filing a false security report to local law enforcement? Dillon asked. Immediate suspension pending a full expedited termination hearing, Harrison replied without missing a beat. Furthermore, filing a false report to airport security is a violation of FAA regulations. They are a liability to the company. Execute it, Dillon commanded. The words hung in the air, absolute and irreversible. Execute it. Done, Sarah Jenkins chimed in from the HR side of the conference call. Captain Richard Miller, employee ID 88492, and Samantha Higgins, employee ID 44910. As of this exact second, you are both suspended without pay. You are stripped of all flight duties. Your company access is revoked, and you are barred from operating any Atlantic Horizon machinery. You can't do this, Miller exploded, his fear suddenly giving way to desperate, flailing anger. He took a step toward Dillon, his fists clenched. I have a union. You can't just fire me on the spot. There's a process. Officer Reynolds immediately stepped between the disgraced pilot and Dillon, pressing a heavy hand firmly against Miller's chest. Take a step back, Mr. Miller, Reynolds warned, his voice dangerously low. Right now. He's right, Richard. Thomas Waverley, the chief legal counsel, spoke up for the first time from the phone speaker. His voice was smooth, carrying the lethal precision of a corporate shark. You do have a union, and your union representative will be present at your termination hearing tomorrow morning. However, you are currently suspended under the gross misconduct and safety liability clause of your contract. That supersedes union grievance timelines. Furthermore, we will be cooperating fully with the FAA regarding your misuse of federal security protocols. Miller stared at the phone, his mouth hanging open. The fight completely left his body, replaced by a hollow, crushing despair. He had spent 2 decades building his career, climbing the ranks to become a senior captain on a flagship route. In less than 15 minutes, his arrogance had incinerated it all. He wasn't just losing his job. With an FAA violation for false security reporting hanging over his head, he would be lucky to ever fly a cargo plane again. "Officer Reynolds," Dillon said politely, looking at the policeman. "As the legal representative of this airline, I am formally requesting that these 2 non-employees be escorted off my aircraft immediately. They are trespassing." Officer Reynolds nodded, a tight, satisfied smile touching his lips. He clearly despised people who wasted police time for petty ego trips. "With pleasure, Mr. Sterling." Reynolds turned to Miller and Samantha. "You heard the man. Hand over your security badges and your company tablets. Let's go." Samantha unclipped her wings from her blouse with trembling fingers, dropping them onto the galley counter. She handed her tablet to the second officer, sobbing openly as she grabbed her roller bag. She didn't look back as she scurried down the jet bridge, a broken, humiliated figure. Captain Miller was slower. He stood there, staring at the 4 gold stripes on his sleeves. He slowly reached up, unclipped his security badge, and placed it on the armrest next to Dillon's phone. He looked at Dillon, his eyes bloodshot and pleading. 20 years, Miller whispered, his voice cracking. "Please, I have a family." "So do the people you threatened to falsely arrest today," Dillon replied, his voice completely devoid of sympathy. "Actions have consequences, Richard. Yours just caught up with you. Get off my plane." Miller closed his eyes, a tear escaping and tracking down his weathered cheek. Defeated, utterly broken, the former captain turned and walked down the aisle, escorted by the very police officers he had called to stroke his own ego. As Miller disappeared into the jet bridge, the silence in the cabin shattered. The passengers in first class, who had been holding their breath for the last 10 minutes, erupted into a spontaneous round of applause. Someone in the back row let out a loud cheer. Dillon didn't smile. He wasn't doing this for applause. He was doing this to excise a rot from a company he had just paid $1 billion to acquire. He turned his attention to the other side of the aisle. Arthur Pendleton was practically shrinking into his plush leather seat, trying desperately to become invisible. He refused to make eye contact with Dillon, staring fixedly at the safety manual in his lap. "Arthur," Dillon said. Arthur jumped as if he had been physically shocked. He looked over, a sickly, sycophantic smile plastered across his face. "Dillon, Mr. Sterling, I can't tell you how embarrassed I am. I had no idea who you were. If I had known—" "Stop right there," Dillon commanded, cutting him off effortlessly. "Let's revisit what you said a few minutes ago. You said you didn't sit next to people who looked like they were headed to a gym in the Bronx. You actively encouraged the crew to have me illegally removed. You cheered them on." Arthur swallowed hard, sweat beading on his upper lip. "I was out of line. It was a long morning. I was stressed about a merger. Please, Dillon, as one businessman to another, let me buy you dinner in New York. Let's smooth this over." "We are not peers, Arthur," Dillon said coldly, "and we are certainly not friends. Sarah, are you still on the line?" "Still here, Dillon," the HR director replied. "Pull up the frequent flyer profile for Arthur Pendleton," Dillon instructed. "Diamond medallion status." "Got it," Sarah confirmed. "Cancel it," Dillon ordered. "Revoke all of his miles, cancel his lounge access, and put his name on the airline's permanent commercial ban list. He is no longer welcome on Atlantic Horizon, our subsidiaries, or any of our partner airlines." Arthur's eyes bulged. "You can't do that. I spend hundreds of thousands of dollars a year with this airline. I am a Diamond member." "You were a Diamond member," Dillon corrected him. "Sterling Management doesn't need your money, Arthur. We value our culture and our true customers more than your corporate account. Now, you can either sit quietly in seat 1B for the duration of this flight, or I can have Officer Reynolds come back and escort you to the terminal. Which will it be?" Arthur opened his mouth to argue, but the cold, hard reality of the situation hit him. He was completely outmatched. He closed his mouth, nodded tightly, and looked out the window, his face burning with a profound, inescapable humiliation. Dillon picked up his phone. "Harrison, where is our reserve crew?" Captain Gregory and a reserve lead flight attendant were already at the terminal lounge, Harrison reported. "They are walking down the jet bridge right now. We'll have you wheels up in 10 minutes. "Thank you," Dillon said, ending the call. He stood up and turned to face the cabin. The remaining flight attendants, who had been hiding in the forward galley, looked at him with wide, terrified eyes. Dillon offered them a small, reassuring nod, letting them know that as long as they did their jobs with respect, they had nothing to fear. "Ladies and gentlemen," Dillon addressed the passengers, his voice projecting clearly. "I apologize for the delay and the unprecedented disturbance this morning. My name is Dillon Sterling, and I am the new owner of this airline. What you witnessed today is entirely unacceptable and does not reflect the standard of service you deserve." He paused, ensuring he had everyone's attention. "To compensate you for your time and the stressful environment, every passenger on this aircraft, from first class to the back row of economy, will be receiving a full refund for today's flight, as well as a voucher for a free round-trip ticket to anywhere Atlantic Horizon flies." The cabin erupted again, this time with genuine, joyous cheers. The tension that had poisoned the air completely evaporated, replaced by an overwhelming sense of relief and justice. Dillon sat back down in seat 1A. He leaned his head against the plush headrest and finally pulled his noise-cancelling headphones up over his ears. As the new captain announced their departure and the Boeing 777 pushed back from the gate, Dillon closed his eyes, a small, genuine smile finally crossing his face. The flight to New York was going to be incredibly peaceful. Flight 408 touched down at John F. Kennedy International Airport, 20 minutes ahead of schedule. For the entire 4.5-hour journey, the cabin had been a sanctuary of flawless, hyper-attentive service. The replacement crew treated every passenger with the kind of golden age hospitality that had long been missing from commercial aviation. Arthur Pendleton spent the entire flight pressed as close to the fuselage as physically possible, staring blankly out the window, a man who had been thoroughly and publicly broken. When the seatbelt sign chimed off, Dillon grabbed his leather duffel from the overhead bin. He didn't gloat. He didn't cast a victorious glance at Arthur. He simply walked off the plane, blending seamlessly into the rushing crowds of Terminal 8, looking like any other exhausted traveler in a Yale hoodie. But while Dillon was quietly stepping into a waiting black SUV on the curb of JFK, a secondary shockwave was violently detonating 2,000 miles away in Phoenix. Brenda Collins, the veteran gate agent who had started the entire morning's cascade of disasters, was blissfully unaware of the corporate execution that had taken place at 30,000 feet. She was 30 minutes away from ending her shift, already thinking about the frozen margarita she was going to pour herself at home. She stood at gate B22, tapping her manicured nails against the keyboard, waiting for her relief to arrive. "Brenda," a sharp voice called out. She turned to see Regional Station Manager Daniel Hayes marching toward the podium. Daniel was a famously mild-mannered man, but today his face was the color of a bruised plum. 2 airport security contractors flanked him. "Daniel, just the man I wanted to see," Brenda chirped, putting on her practiced customer service smile. "I had a really tricky situation this morning with a fraudulent first-class boarder. Handled it perfectly, though. Protected the premium line." "Step away from the terminal, Brenda," Daniel ordered, his voice devoid of any warmth. "Leave your radio and your dispatch keys on the counter. Do not log out of the system. Just step away." Brenda's smile faltered, a cold prickle of dread pooling in her stomach. "Excuse me? What is going on?" "You are being relieved of duty," Daniel said, motioning for the security guards to step closer. "You need to come with me to the administrative offices immediately." Panic flared in Brenda's chest as she was escorted through the busy concourse, passengers staring as the two guards flanked her. When they reached the windowless administrative suite deep in the bowels of the airport, Daniel opened the door to a small conference room. Sitting at the table was the local union representative. Resting in the center of the table was a laptop with a live video feed showing Sarah Jenkins, the head of human resources from New York. "Sit down, Ms. Collins," Sarah commanded through the laptop speakers. Brenda fell into the plastic chair, her heart hammering against her ribs. If this is about the guy in the hoodie this morning, I swear the scanner was acting up. He looked incredibly suspicious, and I was just following security intuition. "Security intuition?" Sarah repeated, her voice dripping with absolute disdain. She pressed a button on her end, and the screen shared a video file. It was the closed-circuit security footage from Gate B-22, crystal clear and in full color. The video showed Dylan Sterling presenting his phone. It clearly showed Brenda's hand violently slamming down to block the scanner before it could even read the code. It captured her snatching his personal property, sneering at him, and waving Arthur Pendleton through like royalty. "The passenger you harassed, racially profiled, and attempted to deny boarding to was Dylan Sterling, the CEO of Sterling Management and the new majority owner of Atlantic Horizon Airlines," Sarah stated, letting the words hang in the suffocating silence of the room. Brenda literally stopped breathing. The blood rushed from her head so fast the room spun. Her mouth opened, but only a pathetic, choked wheeze escaped. "You didn't protect the premium line, Brenda," Daniel said, crossing his arms. "You explicitly violated the Department of Transportation's anti-discrimination statutes, and you did it to the man who signs our paychecks. Because of your intuition, a flagship flight was delayed, police were called, and a senior pilot lost his career. I have 15 years with this company," Brenda finally shrieked, looking desperately at the union rep. "You can't just fire me. Help me." The union representative, a burly man named Carl, just sighed and shook his head, refusing to meet her eyes. "Brenda, the company has you dead to rights on camera, violating federal passenger rights. There is no grievance to file here. You're on your own. Your employment with Atlantic Horizon is terminated, effective immediately," Sarah Jenkins concluded coldly from the screen. "You will not receive severance. Daniel, please have security escort Ms. Collins out of the airport." 10 minutes later, Brenda found herself standing on the sweltering Phoenix curb, clutching her personal belongings in a cardboard box. She had no badge, no job, and no dignity left. Her 15-year career had vanished in the span of a 15-minute meeting, all because she couldn't see past a man's skin color and a cotton sweatshirt. The atmosphere inside the Atlantic Horizon corporate headquarters in Manhattan was electric with terror. Rumors of the bloodbath on Flight 408 had spread through the corporate grapevine faster than a wildfire. When Dylan Sterling stepped out of the private elevator on the 50th floor, 30 high-level executives were waiting for him in the main boardroom. They were all wearing pristine, thousands of dollars designer suits. Dylan was still wearing his gray Yale hoodie and white sneakers. The contrast was glaring, but no one dared even breathe heavily as he walked to the head of the massive mahogany table. "Good morning," Dillon said, tossing his duffel bag into the corner. He didn't sit down. He leaned his knuckles against the polished wood and looked around the room. As of today, Sterling Management holds the reins of this airline, Dillon began, his voice echoing in the cavernous space. I bought this company because I saw immense operational potential. But what I experienced today proved that this company is infected with a toxic, elitist culture that trickles down from this exact room all the way to the gate agents. He pulled up the flight manifest on the projector screen behind him, highlighting the names of Richard Miller, Samantha Higgins, and Brenda Collins in stark red. We are no longer in the business of just flying airplanes, Dillon declared, his eyes locking onto the VP of Customer Relations. We are in the business of human dignity. Effective immediately, every single frontline employee will undergo rigorous, mandated anti-bias and de-escalation training. If anyone, whether they are a gate agent or a four-stripe captain, treats a passenger with the disrespect I was shown today, they will be fired. No warnings, no second chances. Are we absolutely clear? A chorus of frantic, terrified agreements echoed around the boardroom. Good, Dillon said, finally taking his seat at the head of the table. Now let's get to work. Over the next 6 months, the aviation industry watched in awe as Atlantic Horizon transformed. Dillon Sterling's ruthlessly enforced zero-tolerance policy cleared out the old guard of arrogant staff. Customer satisfaction scores skyrocketed. The airline became a beacon of inclusive, high-quality service. But the universe wasn't quite done dispensing karma to those who had earned it on that fateful Tuesday morning. Captain Richard Miller's termination was upheld. But the true devastation came when the FAA concluded their investigation into his false security report. Deeming him a psychological liability, they suspended his commercial transport license. The man who used to strut through terminals in a gold-striped uniform, demanding absolute obedience, was now flying night-shift cargo runs in a rusted-out Cessna for a budget freight company. He spent his nights hauling boxes of auto parts through terrible weather, completely alone, with no one to order around. Samantha Higgins, the flight attendant who thought she was too important to serve a black man in first class, found herself permanently blacklisted from all major carriers. Stripped of her glamorous travel lifestyle and her flight benefits, her social media influencer dreams died entirely. She ended up working the customer service return desk at a big box retail store in a suburban strip mall, forced to wear a garish polyester vest and listen to people yell at her about expired coupons all day long. But perhaps the most agonizing karma was reserved for Arthur Pendleton. Stripped of his diamond status and permanently banned from Atlantic Horizon and its global partners, Arthur's business travel became a living nightmare. 3 months after the incident, Arthur was scheduled to close the biggest real estate deal of his life in London. Because he was banned from the major luxury alliances, he was forced to book a last-minute ticket on a notoriously terrible ultra-low-cost carrier. Arthur found himself crammed into a non-reclining middle seat in the very last row, directly next to the lavatory. The flight was delayed on the tarmac for 6 hours with no air conditioning. When he finally arrived in London, completely disheveled, exhausted, and smelling distinctly of airplane bathroom chemicals, he was 12 hours late. The investors had walked away. The multi-million-dollar deal had collapsed. Arthur sat in the Heathrow terminal, burying his face in his hands, realizing that his arrogance on Flight 408 had just cost him his fortune. Back in New York, Dillon Sterling stood by the floor-to-ceiling windows of his corner office, looking out over the glittering Manhattan skyline. He took a sip of black coffee, watching a silver Atlantic Horizon jet streak across the blue sky in the distance. He smiled, adjusted the hood of his favorite grey sweatshirt, and turned back to his desk. True power didn't need to shout, it didn't need to demean, and it certainly didn't need a designer suit to command respect. True power was simply letting the arrogant dig their own graves and being there to hand them the shovel. And there you have it, a brutal, incredibly satisfying reminder that you never truly know who you are dealing with. This story perfectly illustrates how arrogance and prejudice will eventually blind you to your own downfall. Captain Miller, Samantha, Brenda, and Arthur all thought they were untouchable, protected by their status, their uniforms, or their bank accounts. They mistook Dylan's quiet, unassuming nature for weakness, and it cost them everything they held dear. True power is quiet, patient, and precise. It's the insecure who feel the need to shout and bully. What would you have done if you were in Dylan's shoes? Would you have fired them on the spot or handled it differently? Let me know your thoughts down in the comments below. If you loved this story of instant karma, please smash that like button. Share this video with someone who needs a good revenge story, and subscribe to the channel for more jaw-dropping, true-to-life drama. See you in the next one.